Hello. In this lecture, we're going to look at Mark chapter 9 through 16. This is the third lecture in our series, Becoming Remarkable Disciples. And what we will do is look at these different topics. First, we'll look at the two halves, two parts of Mark. Then we'll look at the Messianic secret. We've mentioned this in previous lectures, but I really haven't unpacked it. Then we'll look at the text in Mark in the second half. So we'll start with Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through the end of chapter 10. Then we'll move to Mark 11 through 13, and then we'll look at the Passion narrative and the ending of Mark. Then we'll move to the themes of Mark. In that case, we'll be going back to the Ranger themes, my acronym for the 6 themes of Mark, and review those, and then finish with the topic we began with in terms of these 3 lecture series, which is on the faithfulness in Mark. So that's our plan for today. So let's begin with the first topic, the two halves of Mark. So we've talked about how there's 2 parts to Mark. This is very common amongst biblical scholars to notice that there's 2 halves or 2 parts to the Gospel of Mark, and that the turning point usually is centered around this 2-stage healing of the blind man at Bethsaida. In our last lecture, we talked about this turning point. And the big difference between the 2 halves is that in the first half, you have Jesus sort of performing a ton of miracles. He's sort of this triumphal entry onto earth. In the second half, Jesus starts predicting his death, and he starts on the way towards Jerusalem, towards the Passion. And much more teaching in the second half in terms of his verbal discourses than what we have in the first half. Now, here I want to rely pretty heavily on Lavertiere's 2-volume commentary on the Gospel of Mark, and he does, I think, a very insightful job of teasing out the differences between these 2 halves and noticing some key symbols that define each half. So just to kind of walk through this chart here that is really trying to summarize Lavertiere's portrayal of Mark. Of course, he makes this big deal, which we've talked about in the first lecture, that the title of Mark is found in verse 1, chapter 1, beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God. And so his point is, if that's the title, then the story, which in the original ending of Mark happens with the empty tomb, that's the beginning of the story of Jesus Christ, not the end of the story of Jesus Christ. That there's a volume 2, or at least the middle or even the end of the story of Jesus Christ. Something more is to come. And we'll talk about that at the end of this lecture. So that's important because that sort of sets up the parameters of what the story is trying to tell. What part of Jesus' reality is he trying to capture. After the prologue, which really is the baptismal scene, we move into the first half itself. Lavertiere makes the point that there's 2 major themes, or symbols, I should say. It's 2 major symbols in the first half, which is the sea and bread. I'll talk about those more in just a moment, so I won't dwell on them here. But he describes the portrayal of Jesus as a theos ener, that's how Jesus is portrayed, which is sort of a divine man, in other words, is the translation for that. He's shown as having supernatural powers. He can expel demons, he can heal the sick, he can control the natural world, he can raise the dead. All these things, miracle after miracle, demonstrating his divine power. And so therefore, in the first half of the gospel, Jesus preaches by doing. He preaches by his actions. He more demonstrates the coming of the kingdom of God rather than talks about the coming of the kingdom of God. And he also, though, oftentimes tells people after he's healed people, or when he encounters demons who also are from the supernatural realm, and so therefore know who Jesus is because they're from the same supernatural kind of state of existence, he will tell them, and they'll say, I know you're the Holy One, and he'll shut them up and say, be quiet. So there's this messianic secret where he doesn't allow the demons to explain who he is or announce who he is. And also when he heals people, he says, don't go around and tell people what I did. Invariably they do, but at least he makes the effort. And almost all the miracles are in this first half of the gospel. There's only 2 miracles in the second half, but it's chock full of miracles in the first half. The action occurs around Galilee, in the northern part of Israel. So in the Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee, these multiple trips across the sea from the western side to the eastern side, as well as north of the Sea of Galilee, is mainly where the action occurs. And as we mentioned, in terms of literary features, there's very little dialogue, no real long discourses other than the description of the sower and the seed parable and the discussion around that. But a heavy use of intercalation. This is also called the Markan sandwich, or my preferred term, the Oreo cookie effect, where you start with a story, cut it halfway through, go to another story, and then come back and pick up that first story. So this is intentional to have the outer parts of the story explain what's the meaning of the inner part, as well as the inner part explaining the meaning of the outer part. So they're meant to be a literary whole, even though they're two separate stories. This intercalation literary technique is a way of saying, see these as a unit. They have the meaning of the two stories are understood in relationship to each other. Well, most of those Markan sandwiches happen in the first half of the gospel. There's really only one very clear example. In the second half, maybe a second one in the second half. So he stops using that particular literary technique in the second half. Okay, as we said, the turning point is the two-stage healing of the blind man. And then if we go to the second half of the gospel, here we have this march towards Jerusalem and his passion. And here the symbols change. Again, I'll explain these in more detail in a moment. But the focus is on the way, the term the way, and the cup. Okay? And here the portrayal of Jesus shifts from the Theos Aner to the suffering Son of Man. A lot of uses of this term Son of Man, and Jesus predicting that he has to go and suffer, and he in the end becomes self-identifies that he is the Son of Man. So we see then Jesus as this suffering figure who's grimly marching to his death. As we said, that the number of miracles decrease. The messianic secret disappears pretty much, and Jesus is more forthright and starts to be more clear about who he is, and that he must suffer. He must go and accept the cross and die. So this suffering servant motif gains more prominence in the second half of the gospel. Also, we have in the second half of the gospel an extended discourse about the end of the world, this apocalyptic vision of the coming of the Son of Man. And in chapter 13, there is a lot more focus upon the sacrificial meal action as substituting for the temple. And that's mainly made clear, obviously, through the Last Supper, but also in the story of the fig tree and the tearing of the temple veil upon Jesus' death. We'll talk about that here in a moment. The action, therefore, moves from the north to the south, from Galilee to Jerusalem, and we have his triumphal entry over the Mount of Olives, and then most of the action happens on the temple grounds. The literary features is that we have Jesus, providing much longer discourses, so his preaching becomes more pronounced in terms of length and focus than what we have in the first half of the gospel. And as I said, we really don't. The use of the intercalation disappears except for one clear example and maybe a second one, which we'll talk about today. And then we have the original ending with the empty tomb, which we'll talk about, and then the tradition, because I wanted to use this text for other for liturgical reasons, and completes the story with the resurrection narratives get added on later on. Okay, so going through the first and second half of the gospel, so comparing and contrasting these two halves. First off, on the first half, it's an action story. Jesus is doing miracle after miracle, and very little dialogue or discourses. In the second half, it's more of a teaching story rather than an action story. Jesus is teaching and giving long discourses about, or significant discourses about the meaning of the coming of the kingdom of God. In the first half, there's a lot of healing stories, and there's 5 crossings back and forth from the east to west side and the west side to the east side of the Sea of Galilee. In contrast, in the second half, there's only 2 healing stories, and there's no sea crossings. And so the emphasis focuses more on his words than his deeds in the second half of the gospel. He's only referred twice as a teacher, only addressed once as a teacher and referred to once as a teacher. So that's not the focus of the first half. But in the second half, 10 times he is called teacher. So again, this shift from his action characterization to his teaching role in the second half. Also, the word immediately, uthos in Greek, appears over 30 times in the first half of the gospel and only 10 times in the second half. We've talked about how there's a gospel in a hurry, right? I call this the giddy-up gospel because the action is so quick. And one way that the author communicates this sort of urgency and movement in the gospel is through this term uthos. Immediately he does this. Immediately the person was healed. And immediately, on and on and on. Well, those diminish in the second half, and the action slows down a little bit in the second half of the gospel. In addition, the question about Jesus' identity is defined in his opposition to and battle with Satan through the miracles, while in the second half, those questions about Jesus' identity continue, and they begin with Peter's confession that he's the Christ, he's the Messiah, and they end with the centurion's confession at the foot of the cross, truly this was the Son of God. But it takes it more away from this controversy or conflict with Satan and more engagement with his disciples and also the opponents, so more of it a dialogue fashion. The first half focuses more on the breadth of the mission that's required to achieve the kingdom of God, while the second half focuses more on the depth. So more instead of kind of like on the breadth of the mission versus the depth, going deeper. And we talked about this in terms of the turning point there with the healing story. Why does it take 2 times for Jesus to heal this blind man, which is the only miracle we have where Jesus isn't successful the first time? And of course, it's used metaphorically, the gospel writer, to make the point that the vision of the disciples have to be refined, and that this requires them to probe more deeply who Jesus is and the meaning of his mission. Okay, and then in the first half, we have this 3-stage process of discipleship where Jesus calls the disciples, creates the 12, and then sends them on mission. We continue to focus upon discipleship in the second half of the gospel, but its focus is helping those disciples, as I just kind of got done describing, move from this vision of, well, who's Jesus? He's this powerful Christ, Messiah figure who can beat up on Satan, to, yeah, that's who he is, but he also is going to redeem the world through suffering. So the essential place of the cross in God's redemptive plan and Jesus' place in that plan. That's what has to be worked on in the second half of this gospel. So I mentioned that Laverdiere makes a big point about these 2 major symbols in the first half of the gospel, and this is based upon their continual repetition of these terms in the first half and their disappearance in the second half of the gospel. And he talks about how in the first half, the sea, the lake, the Sea of Galilee is a big focus of the gospel, and the place of the lake is crucial in terms of the movement of the story. He thinks that this is meant to evoke the crossing of the Red Sea in the Exodus story, particularly the stories of Jesus where he's able to quiet the storms, control the waves, just as Moses controlled the water by parting it. Jesus is able to control it by calming it. And also, and this is making the point that Jesus has this power over primordial chaos. The sea monster Leviathan controlled the seas in the ancient Near East mythology, and that Jesus is able even to control Leviathan. You see Leviathan, that figure, appearing in the book of Job and also some of the Psalms. And so this idea that water is seen as the place of chaos and darkness and fear, and Jesus is able to control it. And that this connects him obviously to Genesis 1, where God looks over the watery void, and then creates order by drawing forth the land, the light and the darkness, and the land from the water and what have you. Well, Jesus, in some ways, has that same power. Does have that same power to over the chaotic universe to give it order. And that therefore these sea crossings, Laverdiere would say, anytime we see the disciples in the boat, it's really symbolizing his Christian community in some way, that they are experiencing this sort of chaotic moment of being tossed around on the waves by the persecution they're experiencing, and that how do they trust that Jesus will calm those waves. So he sees that the sea crossings as a symbol of the chaotic transformations and transitions that the Markan community has gone through. All right, then the second symbol is bread, ho artos. And we've already made mention in a previous lecture that half the calories that a person gained in the Mediterranean diet during the first century was through bread. So key to life was bread. And unfortunately, in our English translations, invariably the translators will diminish the number of usages of bread, because it's a little awkward in modern day English to say, and they ate bread, and they ate bread, they ate bread. So they will say they ate food, or they ate even. So we don't get the same feel for how many times the word artos shows up in the first half of the gospel, which makes it remarkable that in the second half of the gospel, it only appears twice, that word. It appears once in a saying in chapter 10 where Jesus says, what parent, when asked for bread, will give their child a stone? And then, of course, at the Last Supper. But otherwise, given how prevalent this discussion of bread is, and we looked at this with the story about Jesus says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. They're in the boat, and they had no bread, but they had one loaf. I talked about that in the last lecture. And, obviously the point there is this Eucharistic presence of Jesus within the community. They aren't recognizing him in the Eucharist, I think is the point. That's what Mark is trying to communicate to his community about in the way he tells that story. All right, so this Eucharistic focus that the Mark has, he makes evident not only through his constant use of the word bread, but also in those multiplication of fish and loaves stories. He uses the Eucharistic terminology, the Eucharistic verbs that are used in the Eucharistic prayers of the early Christians, which we can see in the Didache as well as in Paul. These taking, breaking, giving, and also using this word blessing. I should put that list in there too: taking, blessing, and giving. But also uses these unique words like klasmata, which the early Christians used to describe the pieces of broken bread, which is kind of an unusual Greek word to use for the pieces of bread. So all this has Eucharistic overtones. Okay, the second half of the gospel, the symbols change, and the focus upon the way, hehodos, in Greek, that there's constantly describing he's on the way. The sea disappears. Instead of them traveling back and forth on the sea, they're now on the way on land. And obviously this is a key theme within biblical tradition, especially in wisdom literature, which describes a way of life. And but also in prophetic literature, it's often seen as the coming or the way of the Lord. Prepare the way of the Lord. We saw that in Isaiah 40 verse 3 in the first lecture, where we were talking about John the Baptist's ministry, and this verse is actually alluded to in that story of the baptism of Jesus and John the Baptist's ministry. So the way is the way of Jesus, the Son of God, on his way to Jerusalem to engage with his destiny in taking up with the cross and also his resurrection. And so therefore, it seems and the second half is refining the vision of the disciples. It's trying to get the disciples to understand that intimately following Jesus means engaging with suffering, which would explain why they're being persecuted for their faith now. And interesting enough, early Christians seem to have called themselves people of the way. That's the self-designation they gave for themselves. It's others that called them Christians, and later, obviously, Christians adopted that as their own moniker. But we see in Acts chapter 9 that the first name Christians seem to use for themselves is people of the way. So this imagery of being on the way was a very early Christian understanding of what is a Christian. He's a person on the way. Also, as mentioned, the symbol of cup appears in the second half. It's not in the first half. We don't see allusions to the word cup, but we do see it here in the second half. On multiple occasions, this image is used. And obviously, it relates to the Passover and the Exodus covenant. But also, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, a fourth of people's calories came from drinking wine. This is the way in which they achieve fruit intake, was how you preserve fruit in a dry environment. And people would drink up to 1 liter a day of wine. And it was obviously to achieve nutrition, not for reasons for getting drunk. But Mark doesn't talk about the cup as an object itself, but rather about participating or drinking from the cup. So it implies that that there's a joining in, if you will, with a solidarity with Jesus in the cup. And the cup imagery is very clearly connected to the passion and resurrection of Jesus, right? That he has to accept this cup and drink from this cup. And can you drink from the cup that I must drink from? And all this kind of discussion is making it clear that the cup is not simply Eucharistic, although it has that intonation. It's also meant to say that it's connected to the cross, right? And obviously we see that most directly at the Garden of Gethsemane, and that therefore we too, as disciples, should accept the cross, the cup, if the Father wills to give us to us. Okay, so there's the two halves of Mark. Now let's move on to the Messianic secret. We've touched on the Messianic secret in the past, but haven't really explained it. Multiple occurrences where Jesus either tells the demons, don't tell people who I am, or when he heals people, he says, don't tell anybody what I do. And invariably, those people that he does heal go and tell everybody what he did. Why is this here is kind of the question. You can see I've listed here the examples of it. And one thing you should notice that it diminishes after the first half. In the second half, it's really with his disciples. It's not with people he heals or demons that he says, don't say anything. And we'll have to discuss why is that there aren't as many Messianic secret moments in the second half, and B, when there are, the few there are, they're at the beginning of the second half, and they're pointed towards his disciples, not to the people he healed or demons. Now, there's one exception in chapter 5, which we talked about when we looked last lecture at that chapter, where Jesus actually tells the man who he's healed, go ahead and tell people about it. But that was on the Gentile side, right? Remember that? That's the man who's possessed and living amongst the tombs, and he casts the demons into the pigs who run into the lake. And that man seems to be that the point is he understands who Jesus is, so he can talk about him. He's also on the Gentile side versus the Jewish side. Remember we talked about how the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River runs through it, and there's the western side, which would be the Jewish side, and then the eastern side, which would be more the Gentile side. Okay. Then, so as I talked about, there seems to be the shift after the healing of the blind man. Before that, there's only sort of these allusions to the Jesus' identity, and he doesn't talk about his suffering and death, and the disciples don't seem to know who Jesus is. Remember, we have all these stories about him walking by in the water. They think he's a ghost or whatever. So they don't fully understand who Jesus is. In the second half of the gospel, after the healing of the blind man, Jesus more directly engages the question about who he is and the meaning of his need to suffer and die. He talks openly about that, and that still the disciples don't quite get it until the very end. Kind of this point that they still have a vision of Jesus, the coming of the kingdom of God, that's focused more on an earthly sense of power rather than a divine sense of redemptive suffering as the means by which God's power will be exercised. All right, so many scholars have wondered, why is this messianic secret here? Why does Mark use this focus on this? And there's three dominant interpretations. One is that and I'll just read this is from Christian theological tradition. I think this book provides a nice little summary of three different options, the dominant ones in biblical scholarship for explaining the purpose of the messianic secret. And one is that the writer of Mark's gospel wanted to explain in retrospect why it was that some people, namely Jews, did not accept Jesus and the message that he came to preach. Mark explains that Jesus deliberately kept some people from hearing and understanding his message. So that's one explanation, sort of a historical explanation. The second one is that the writer of Mark's gospel wanted to illustrate in a literary way the forcefulness of the message of Jesus Christ, because immediately the people went out and did just the opposite when he told them, don't tell anybody about this. So it was as if the message of God's kingdom simply could not be silenced. That's another reason possibly for the messianic secret. Its purpose is simply to say people are so excited about it, they have to tell people about it. Third option is Jesus did not want people to identify him as the Messiah because people had the wrong idea of what that meant. Instead of the glorious and powerful Messiah they had long awaited, he would be a Messiah who must suffer. I personally fall more into that third camp. Here's my own description of the purpose of the messianic secret, and I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. I won't bother reading the first paragraph. It's really just posing the question, why does Mark use the messianic secret? So I would say this in the second paragraph. Mark neither doubts nor disdains the miracle tradition of Jesus. In fact, Mark's Christian contemporaries knew of divinely empowered miracle workers. Moreover, the apocryphal stories, so these are stories in writings that don't make it into the gospel, moreover, apocryphal stories of Jesus also emphasize his magical powers. However, such popular one-sided emphasis on Jesus as the divine miracle worker is rejected in the Gospel of Mark, not by ignoring that role, but by placing it within the context of Jesus' passion. So I think that's the point. To understand the purpose of Jesus' miracles, it has to be put within the context of the passion. For Mark, the heart and center of Jesus' ministry is the suffering and death on the cross. In fact, some biblical scholars will say that Mark's gospel is primarily about the cross, what he's appended to it is the life of Jesus. I wouldn't go that far, but that's kind of this point that the focus is upon the suffering and death on the cross. Therefore, Mark desires to subsume the miracle tradition within the perspective of Jesus' death. Accordingly, Mark portrays Jesus as not wanting people to extol his miraculous deeds. Rather, he characteristically enjoins silence about them. Mark's purpose is to make this point clear. The nature of Jesus' identity ultimately is not fully revealed in the miracles. I think that's the key point. His purpose. The nature of Jesus' identity ultimately is not fully revealed in the miracles. The real identity question in Mark is not whether Jesus was the Messiah, but why he was the kind of Messiah he was. Further within the gospel, the messianic secret focuses the reader's attention on the question of the nature of Jesus' messiahship, and consequently upon the nature of Christian discipleship. The disciples' expectation of a miracle working Messiah who delivers his followers from all unpleasantness into a great reward is rejected. So sort of this simplistic understanding about what does it mean that he has proclaimed the coming of the kingdom of God. It's not a prosperity gospel that he's come to announce. The messianic secret restrains and tones down the miracle tradition of Jesus precisely because the reader is being forced to acknowledge and accept Jesus' suffering. In the end, it is Mark's perspective that the winning of true disciples can take place only through the suffering death of Jesus. Okay? For true discipleship consists of more than just awe at the supernatural or fear at the realities of human finitude. More is needed for the response of faith. Faith requires acts of loyalty, responses of compassion, victories over evil through suffering, and ultimately a total self-giving through love. Okay, so I think this is the point of the gospel, is that yes, Jesus exercised divine power, definitely. But if you just have faith in the divine power without seeing how that divine power requires the engagement with suffering, and it's through suffering that the world is redeemed, then you haven't gotten the point of the miracles. Okay? So moving on then from the Messianic secret, let's now move into the actual text we find in the second half of the gospel. We will move through these very quickly. Since we're already at a half hour, I'm going to try to keep this lecture as brief as I can. So I'm going to cover this in kind of a 20,000 foot level in some ways. So, but just to give us an overview of the second half of Mark's gospel, let's go through the end of chapter 8 to the end of chapter 10. So first off, we had this healing of the blind man at Bethsaida, and then we have another healing at the end of chapter 10 of a healing of a blind man. Those form an inclusio. And I think the point of why he structures his gospel, Mark structures his gospel at this point with these two healing stories, since we have so few healing stories in the second half of the gospel, is to make this point that Jesus has to refine the disciples' vision on his identity and the way to the cross, that they're integrally connected. All right? There are three blocks of material in these chapters, basically these two chapters in Mark. Each one is initiated with Jesus predicting his suffering and death. And immediately it's followed by the disciples arguing over that power. So, we saw this with regard to Jesus predicting his death, and then Peter says, Jesus, let's rethink that. We can do this another way. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. If we look at chapter 9, verse 30, Jesus predicts his death, and immediately after he does so, what happens? Well, we have the disciples start to argue with each other, and about the meaning of who's the greatest in the kingdom, right? Then, and Jesus says, the last shall be first, the first shall be last. Then in chapter 10:32, Jesus again predicts his death, and what's followed? It's this argument, where James and John want to be on his right hand when he comes into his kingdom. All right? And so we have this kind of continual response after Jesus predicts death. The disciples react, and they're like, hey, let's talk about glory, not suffering, right? And Jesus says, well, glory is achieved through suffering. Okay, so that's the point of this whole section. I'd say some people have even called this that this section, Mark 8:31 to the end of 10, is a mini course on discipleship. This refining of the vision of the disciples, the second stage of their understanding about the meaning of who Jesus is and what it means to be a disciple, is what he's working through with this material. And that he has to refine their vision of what it means for him to be the Messiah or the Son of Man, and that the coming of God's kingdom is not about brute force, it seems to be their default understanding, but about redemptive suffering. Okay. Okay, so moving out of Mark chapters 8:31 to 10:45, we'll move now to Mark 11 through 13. Wish we could dig into a lot of those texts, but go ahead and read through that. I mean, again, I think what's beautiful about those chapters is that it's this mini course on discipleship. And if you read it with those lenses, I think you'll get a lot out of those texts. But let's move on to 11 through 13. And in 11, we have the triumphal entry of Jesus coming into Jerusalem. I think we're all kind of familiar with that story from the Mount of Olives. That obviously has overtones to the prophetic tradition that this is where the Messiah was going to come, and Zechariah was going to arrive over the Mount of Olives. A lot I could say about that story, but because of time, we'll keep moving forward. Because what I want to focus upon is the story that immediately follows the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And this is the story of the fig tree. So, and what we're going to have in the back of our minds as we go through this story is, given Jesus' criticism and action, what is the essential teaching here about faith and what needs to be in the disciples' heart? So keep that kind of in the back of your mind. I'll have that prompt question sort of on every slide, most of these slides, so that kind of keeps it there in front of us. But let's just read through the story about the fig tree, which, by the way, is the one and only intercalation, the clear intercalation story in the second half of the Gospel of Mark, or the Markan sandwich, or, as you know, my favorite term, the Oreo cookie literary effect. Okay, so let's read this story. The next day, as they were leaving Bethany, he was hungry. Seeing from a distance a fig tree in leaf, he went over to see if he could find anything on it. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves. It was not the time for figs. Yes, the Passover, right? He's there for the Passover, and it's not the season for figs. That's much later in the season, right, that you get figs ripened. And he said to it in reply, "May no one ever eat of your fruit again." And his disciples heard it. Okay. Then they came to Jerusalem, and on entering the temple area, he began to drive out those selling and buying there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. He did not permit anyone to carry anything through the temple area. Then he taught them, saying, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer? Now, I emphasize the words house of prayer because we're going to come back to that in the intercalation, right? In the framework of the intercalation. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. And notice he says for all peoples, which is interesting because we've talked about how this gospel has seems to be addressing the needs of Mark's community, which is both Jewish and Gentile, right? As Gentiles convert into the Christian faith. But you have made it a den of thieves. The chief priests and the scribes came to hear of it and were seeking a way to put him to death. We saw them earlier in the story. They came and confronted him, right? Earlier when Jesus warned his disciples about the leaven of the chief priests and the Pharisees. So this is the leaders, the Jewish leaders. And they early on were starting to seek his death, and now they're intensifying that. But notice we've connected with this line about it should be a house of prayer for all peoples with their desire to put him to death. Yet they feared him because the whole crowd was astonished at his teaching when he came. When evening came, they went out of the city. That's the disciples. Okay, so leaving. Early in the morning, as they were walking along, so coming back to the temple, they came from Bethany, came to the temple. They had passed by a fig tree. They went back home. Now they're coming back the next morning, coming back from Bethany to the temple. So early in the morning, as they were walking along, they saw the fig tree withered at its roots. Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." Jesus said to them in reply, "Have faith in God." I've underlined the word faith. This connects us to what is he saying here about faith and what has to be in the disciples' hearts. Have faith in God. Amen, I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be lifted up and thrown into the sea. The one and only reference to the sea, by the way, I forgot to mention that earlier. Thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will happen. So the one and only reference to the sea in the second half of the gospel talks about how connects that with something going on in your heart. If you don't have doubt but belief in your heart, then you'll be able to accomplish lifting up this mountain and casting it into the sea. It shall be done to him. Therefore, I tell you, all that you ask for in prayer, believe that you will receive, and it shall be yours. When you stand to pray, forgive anyone against whom you have a grievance, so that your heavenly Father may in turn forgive you your transgressions. Now, that last phrase, that sounds very familiar to us because it's a line out of the Lord's Prayer. You know, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. What's interesting is you do not have the Lord's Prayer in Mark's Gospel. It appears in Matthew and Luke's Gospel. Jesus teaches the Lord's Prayer. But in Mark, you don't have Jesus teaching the Lord's Prayer. But here we have one of the tenets. If you think about the Lord's Prayer, it says, Our Father who art in heaven, that's what you're praying to, hallowed be thy name. And now here's what's being prayed for. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's what the prayer is for. You know, we want the kingdom of God to be present here on heaven as it is present, on earth as it is present in heaven. And then Jesus outlines 3 ways we're going to make that happen. God's going to make that happen. God's going to give us our daily bread, so we're going to have food. And then we have to give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Okay, so we're going to have forgiveness. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So we need to have fortitude. So 3 F's to achieve the coming of the kingdom on earth. Food, everybody should have enough food to eat, justice. Forgiveness, which seems to be emphasized here, and I think is one of the key emphases of Jesus' ministry, the power of forgiveness. And fortitude, the need to maintain faith. Mark does not teach the Lord's Prayer, doesn't recount the Lord's Prayer in his gospel, but I think he has the same idea, that this is how Jesus envisioned the kingdom would be achieved, is by food, forgiveness, and fortitude. And this is what his community has to understand. So the question becomes, how do you, why he's talking about prayer and he connects forgiveness to it. So a key element to belief is forgiveness, in Mark's gospel. So I think what is being emphasized here in that story is, if I can go back, I didn't mean to press forward. If we go back, so what's going on? Well, obviously the point, and we'll see this as we move forward in these chapters, is that Mark's vision is that Jesus is, through the Last Supper, is offering a new sacrifice that replaces the temple sacrifice. Remember, Mark's being written, most scholars would say, either sometime between 65 and 70. Well, the temple's destroyed in 70. So he has a sense that the way in which the sacrificial system is tethered, Jesus comes to say that it's not tethered just at a place, but rather when you come together and you break the bread and bless the cup through the Eucharist, this new sacrifice, right? And so in Mark's theology, he's trying to say the time for seeing where God is primarily located, where the nexus where we meet him most definitively and powerfully, is not at this geographic location, of a Temple Mount, but rather it's in the Eucharist. And he uses the fig tree story to make this point, that the fig is not producing fruit because its season is not now. It's past, I think, is his vision. And instead, this new, and when they come back and he goes and cleanses the temple, right? He cleanses the temple because it's not achieving what it needs to achieve, because it's not a house of prayer for all. It's not inclusive enough, right? And it has been contorted by powers and political processes, which we talked about earlier in this course. That now it is not able to achieve its function that it once was, right? And so now the way in which this nexus of the divine and the human come together most definitively and powerfully is through the institution of the Eucharist. I think that's what's going on in Mark's gospel. He's trying to make this point. He's using the story about the fig tree to make these points. And a key element in this new reality is forgiveness. Because when you went to the temple, one of the things you would do is if you had sinned, you offered forgiveness. You offered a sacrifice asking for God's forgiveness. But now, what do? Now in prayer, because the temple is supposed to be a place of prayer, you have to forgive others. You have to forgive others. The focus shifts a bit here. It's not about asking for my forgiveness. It's about me forgiving others. This is the new reality of the kingdom of God. This is how the power of God will be exercised, and that will redeem the world is actually not so much by me focusing upon me and how God can help me, but how I have failed others and how I can forgive can forgive them if they've have a grievance against me. How I need to be a forgiving person myself, right? How I have to, in some sense, give up the power that I hold over another. If I hold a grievance, I sort of hold a power over them. Well, then I have to let that go. I have to release it. And because actually, if you don't forgive, they actually hold the power over you. Ironically, if you continually have this grievance. But I think the idea is that we have to see that sometimes we hold on to our grievances because we think that gives us power. And God's saying, no, it doesn't give you power. It gives you weakness, actually, because you're, in some sense, strangled by your grievance. But if you let it go, you free yourself and you free the other person through the grace of God. Right? Okay. Okay, so this is the point, is that I think what's going on with this story here in Mark, in the fig tree story and the cleansing of the temple. The key story, I think, in Mark's understanding about how the kingdom of God will be achieved. And as I've said, one of the themes is his community is asking, where is the presence of God? What's in the Eucharist? Don't you get what Jesus was about with the Last Supper? He's one of the key points of his whole gospel, I think. That's how we can maintain our sense of connection and tapping into the power of God, is through the experience of the Eucharist, I think, in Mark's gospel. Okay, now let's go to Mark 11 through 13. Again, we'll do the rest of it. We'll do this rather briefly. But after this fig tree story, most of the events that happen is on the Mount of Olives in these 3 chapters, or at the Temple Mount. We have 4 controversy stories that all happen on the Temple Mount. And you can see I've broken out here. These are contests with the Jewish leaders, the chief priests, the scribes, the elders. And we kind of saw this in the last section, but it becomes clear in these controversy stories. There's sort of a pattern for all these. There's hostility between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. Then there's amazement in terms of his response. There's the opponents are silenced. And then there's admiration from the crowd. This is sort of the pattern for all 4 of those stories. The issue underlying all those debates is Jesus' authority, his power. In Greek, exousia. And it was interesting, therefore, because those stories basically are happening at the end of 11 through 12. When we get, if you look at my last bullet point, I didn't put the number 12, the chapter number before the verse numbers. I apologize that on my list. I just noticed that. But, so therefore, we turn to Mark 13. What's discussed? That's the eschatological discourse, where Jesus talks about the coming Son of Man, kind of setting things right? We'd call that the second coming. So there's a sense that the power of God will be completed in the future at a later point. I think this is crucial to Mark's gospel, because remember, he's talking about the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God. That's what the whole gospel is about. What's volume 2 or maybe even 3? Well, that involves the second coming of Jesus Christ, right? Okay, so that's sort of telling a foretaste of the rest of the story. All right. Okay, so moving out of 11 through 13, let's move now to the Passion story and the ending of Mark. A lot we could unpack in the Passion story, obviously, but we're going to focus on a couple of things and talk about the ending. There may be an intercalation story in here where where Peter in the denial in Jesus when he's on trial in chapter 14. We can talk about that, but basically the point is that when Jesus is arrested, it's reported that Peter goes to the courtyard. Then we have Jesus on trial, and then we come back to Peter in the courtyard and people saying, "Hey, aren't you one of his followers?" So some people contend that's an intercalation. There's only one brief mention about Peter following him, but I understand the argument, but it's not as robust as some of the other intercalations we've seen. Okay, but what's interesting here in chapter 14, 53 through 72, is that finally Jesus reveals who he is. When they ask him, "Are you the Son of the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus says, when he's on trial, he says, "I am. I am." Now, if you've studied John's Gospel, you know that "I am" is a crucial statement because it ego eimi in Greek, but in the Septuagint, when God is asked when Moses asks God, "What is your name?" at the burning bush, so that I can tell the people, and they'll know that I had this revelation, this experience with you. He says, "Tell them I am. I am." Which was where we get the word Yahweh in Hebrew. So here Jesus says, "I am," but the overtones, the double entendre, I think there is Yahweh. He is God. Not only is he the Son of the Blessed One, he is God. That statement, because he claims to be the Son of the Blessed One, the high priest tears his garment. It's not the same exact verb. Schizomai is the verb that we see when Jesus is baptized, and I mentioned this first lecture. The skies are torn apart, and then when he's killed at the cross, the moment he dies on the cross, the veil that covers the Holy of Holies in the temple is torn apart. That's there. The verb is schizomai. Here, there's a different verb used, but there could be sort of this allusion to this tearing. It's the fullness is not there, which may be why he doesn't use the whole verb. It's not the inbreaking. In those two stories, that's the work of God. So he uses schizomai for that, I think. It's kind of radical tearing language. Here, it's the chief priest rendering his garments, but I think there's sort of an allusion to that. And I don't think he wants to use schizomai because it's not God doing the action, it's the chief priest when he hears who Jesus is. When he hears Jesus admitting that he is the Son of God. All right. As I mentioned, this story begins and ends with Peter. And in the second, after that, we pick it up after Jesus announces that he is the Son of God, Son of the Blessed One, or admits to that. We have Peter denying Jesus 3 times. I think the point here, we should talk about the disciples. I've made some allusions to this in earlier lectures, but why are the disciples portrayed the way they are? Well, part of that's historical. I mean, all of the Gospels talk about Peter's denials. So I think Peter denied Jesus at the crucial moment of his arrest and trial. But I think the Gospel writer wants to accentuate Peter's role here in Mark because he's dealing with a community that's under stress, being persecuted. Maybe some people have faltered. They haven't been as faithful as desired to be. And I think Mark, by accentuating Peter and even some of the lack of understanding of the disciples, he's trying to say, don't lose heart. Don't lose heart. Even Peter failed. And Jesus, forgave him. And Peter became the leader of the church, right? So have hope. Have hope. So I think it may surprise us that in some ways, remember one of my, in my 6 themes, I called the disciples the Nimrodic or no good disciples. Doesn't. The point is, I think in Mark he describes or portrays the disciples in less than flattering ways to give people encouragement, ironically, to say they weren't perfect either. So, just stay the course. If you stumble, pick yourself up. Let God's grace pick you up, and stay the course. Because look what glorious things they did. You got to learn to walk before you can run, kind of thing. And the disciples weren't the greatest walkers at the beginning. They had to learn this too, right? So I think that's the point and the reason for the portrayal of the disciples in Mark's gospel, and particularly of Peter, is to kind of give this encouragement to his own community. All right, so in terms of the Passion, I'm only going to look at the death scene, make a few comments about it. And so let's just read the text. They brought him to the place of Golgotha, which is translated place of the skull. They gave him wine drugged with myrrh, but he did not take it. Then they crucified him and divided his garments and cast lots for them to see what each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, King of the Jews. With him they crucified 2 revolutionaries, one on his right and one on his left. Those passing by reviled him, shaking their heads and saying, Ah, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself by coming down from the cross. Likewise, the chief priests and the scribes mocked him among themselves and said, He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from his cross that we may see and believe. Remember, they were always asking for a sign. So here they are again, asking for a sign. Those who were crucified with him also kept abusing him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Elo, Elo, lema sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is actually an allusion to a psalm. And that psalm, it's the first line of a psalm. And if you read that psalm, it actually has trust in God's redemptive action. Some of the bystanders who heard it said, Look, he is calling Elijah. One of them ran, soaked a sponge with wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, Wait, let us see if Elijah comes to take him down. Remember, Elijah is taken up in a fiery chariot and therefore never dies into heaven. So they're expecting Elijah. There's this expectation in Jewish tradition that he will come back. Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. The veil of the sanctuary was torn in 2 from top to bottom. It was schizomide. It was torn from the top and bottom. When the centurion who stood facing him saw how he breathed his last, he said, Truly this man was the Son of God. So here's this most profound and complete confession of who Jesus is, and it's at the lips of a Gentile, the centurion, which I think is crucial in Mark's gospel, since again we've talked about how his community has expanded to include Gentiles and the place they hold, that the first person that truly understands the meaning of the cross is a Gentile in the Mark's gospel, because the confession comes from his lips. All right. So we talked about at the beginning, the first lecture, we have this unique start and finish to Mark's gospel. It begins with his baptism, not with the nativity, and it ends with his tomb, an empty tomb. If we were to continue reading the story, that he's laid to rest, and then the women go to anoint the body, and they find the tomb empty. And in chapter 16, verse 8, it ends there originally. We have manuscripts where that's where the earliest manuscripts, that's best of manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark, that's where it ends. Then later on, the tradition seems to have added on resurrection stories. Rightly so, if you're going to use this liturgically and within a community context, if you don't have volume 2, because that's not the end of the story, and tradition knows that. But for Mark, I think, as I talked about in the first lecture, he ends it with the empty tomb, where they all go leave amazed and astonished, because the next part of the story is the resurrection. And the resurrection is not just the resurrection of Jesus himself, but also the imbuing of the Spirit within the community to continue his work. Basically what Luke does, right? Luke has this understanding when he writes the gospel and then follows it up with Acts, that the work of Jesus Christ, the good news of Jesus Christ, doesn't end with his resurrection even. It ends with the ongoing work of the church, right? Of the Spirit in the church. So that's the good news of Jesus Christ. is not just his incarnation, nor even just of his resurrection, but of the ongoing presence of his Spirit in the church through the Holy Spirit. All right, so I think that's the point. I think what Mark wants to say to his community is, okay, empty tomb. I'm going to leave it there because you need to really believe that he's risen. Let's make that kind of the end of the story, so you have to make a decision. You have to accept that he did rise, that's what the meaning of that empty tomb is. I'm not going to give you the simple answer. You need to wrestle with that because we're in a moment of crisis, of persecution, and you need to truly believe that he is the Messiah, the Son of God, that he rose from the dead, or else you won't be able to persist through this persecution, this suffering, right? It won't have meaning unless that truly has happened, and that has to be in your heart, that you believe that he's risen. And so I think that's why he leaves the story there, to challenge his own community. Okay, so let's move then finally to summarize the themes of Mark's gospel. I gave you this at the beginning of the first lecture, but now you can walk through it and say, well, does this make sense? Are these 6 themes the right things to emphasize within Mark's gospel in terms of understanding what his goals are in terms of addressing the needs of his community? So first, R is reclaiming, and remember I talked about this because I made connections to the Lone Ranger, the theme song, the William Tell Overture, that I thought that song kind of gave us the feel of it could be a theme song for the Gospel of Mark. But so why, that's just explaining why we're using this as an acronym, Ranger. So Jesus comes to reclaim the earth by beating up on Satan is the first theme. But then we have this messianic secret. He's the anonymous Messiah. That who is this person, and that is purposeful as a means to get people to dig deeper and not just be captivated by the power, if you will, the magical power of the miracles, but the supernatural power of the miracles. To understand that they indicate the power of God, but that power of God is also exercised through the cross, through suffering. A redemptive suffering, which we'll get to. The Nimrodic disciples, I just talked about that with Peter, that they're portrayed as being, somewhat adequate to give hope to the community, to say, yeah, you've maybe failed. Maybe you're not feeling like you're the greatest of all disciples. Don't worry. The earliest disciples took them God's grace to kind of move forward and deeper into the reality of discipleship. And then Gideon Gospel, talked about this with regard to the use of the word uthos, but just the whole gospel. It's a short gospel, but it's just kind of, it's very quick, fast-moving, fast-paced kind of gospel. And then we have Eucharistic power. I talked about from Louverdier that you have this Eucharistic substructure of the bread and wine from the first half to the second half in terms of the major symbols. But also through our detailed discussion of the multiplication stories of the fish and loaves, that these have Eucharistic undertones as well. And the whole point, I think, for Mark is he has a community that's being persecuted. They're wondering, where is Jesus? Where can I get in? I know he's powerful when he's here, but where's that power now? And he says, don't you get the point of the Eucharist? That's what that's about. There's where we encounter Jesus. There's where we receive his power. There's where we are sustained. And then finally, redemptive suffering, this point that the cross is about redeeming the world, and that God exercises his power through weakness, which is a contradiction of terms in some ways, right? But that's how God works. So basically, we kind of move back and say, okay, so what are the main things to take away from the gospel? In terms of its writing, most scholars say it was written sometime between 65 and 70 CE or AD. His audience are a group of persecuted Christians who seem to be both Jewish and Gentile. His sources are the oral and written traditions of a believing community. I didn't talk about this, but there's good reasons to believe that he might have access to a miracle source in the first half of the gospel, and also maybe his passion narrative pre-exists him. So he might have some written sources he's drawing upon, but clearly oral sources. Its structure, it's a 2-part story. We've talked about that in this lecture, first and second half. Its theme is that Jesus' power and presence is available through the Eucharist, which sustains the disciples during their suffering to continue the ongoing struggle to establish the kingdom of God here on earth. And then it starts with the baptism and ends with the empty tomb, at least originally, and then the church, as it starts to use it catechetically, you start liturgically, it adds on the resurrection story, so that it holds, tells the whole story of the incarnation of Jesus. All right. Then if we turn to this topic of faithfulness, which we also began with in the first lecture, we want to come back to that and talk about what can we, after we've gone through the whole gospel, what can we say about faithfulness in Mark. I start here with this depiction. This is a piece of graffiti found in the Palatine Palace in Rome. So this is the Caesar's palace, the servants' quarters. Is found in the servants' quarters of the Palatine Palace, so the Caesar's palace in Rome. Usually dated 2nd century, right? So pretty early in terms of in Christianity. And what do you have here? Well, you can kind of tell. You've got some words written here, which we'll talk about. You have some person depicted here, and then you have a cross. This is clearly a cross. We have right here, and a person on it, but look, he has a horse's or a donkey's head on top of him. And it says Alexamenos. That's the person's name. This must be, we're guessing this is Alex right here. Alexamenos. Sabete Theon. Sabete Theon. So Alexamenos is a name, Alexander. Alexander, Sabete, worship God. Theon, God, worship God. So this is what this graffiti is saying. Well, it seems to be that whoever drew this and wrote this is mocking Alex. It's mocking Alex because he's saying that Alex is worshiping someone who's died on the cross who has a donkey's head. Well, clearly they're mocking Christianity. They're mocking Alex's belief in Jesus Christ because they said, how could that be Jesus? He died on a God. How could that be God? Jesus died on a cross. That's and even kind of with this head of a donkey, saying this is asinine, your belief. Well, Paul recognized that in his letter to the Corinthians when he said, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. So I think there's a big point and purpose of Mark's gospel is, do you see the work of God in the cross? This is a big emphasis in Paul. But I think that Mark is making the same point that Paul is about the meaning of the cross in a different way. But to say to his fellow companions, his community, you have to recognize that the cross is saying something significant, that Jesus is killed, Jesus dies on an instrument of state torture. It's like someone dying in an electric chair today, but he dies on an instrument of state torture and execution to show that God's redemptive work is not going to happen through, ways that the people may be expected, through political power. No, but through redemptive suffering. Not through political power, but through redemptive suffering. And so therefore you have to be willing to be mocked. Like Alex was mocked. You will experience, I think what Mark is saying to his community, you will experience what Jesus experienced, which is suffering, which is persecution, which is mockery. And the question is, will you retain your steadfast faith? So, we talked about faithfulness in the New Testament. The word used there is pistis, or pistuon, and it means trust, loyalty, belief, confidence. But the translation I like best is to give one's heart to give one's heart to. And I think Mark's gospel comes down to, do you give your heart to Jesus? Right? Do you have a relationship with him? Right? Because you give your heart to somebody that you are connected to, right? Not an ideal, not a set of principles, but to a person. Do you bind yourself to the person of Jesus Christ? Right? That's the question that confronts his community. And so faithfulness in Mark then is not a nebulous religious attitude or a body of intellectual content, but a mighty, fearful force for healing and fulfillment of God's will. And what's interesting is that what we see in Mark's gospel is that those who have faith are one-scene characters. they, we have the man who is possessed, who Jesus casts out the demons from him, and he knows who Jesus is, and he professes faith, and then we don't see him again. Well, I think Mark wants to say, you're struggling. That makes you have a particular relationship, because just like the disciples, they stayed with Jesus and they struggled with fully understanding who and what he was and what the meaning of the kingdom of God was. So those who have a special relationship with him are those who struggle to stay sustained in Jesus. Because those one-scene characters don't stay with Jesus. I don't think he's condemning them, but he's not saying that that's the model of discipleship. That's not the model of discipleship in Mark. The model of discipleship is actually the people who struggle. That's the model of discipleship, ironically. And so if you're struggling, great. It's actually a sign that you're a faithful disciple, that you're a true disciple. You're not just a believer, you're a disciple. Not just a believer, you're a disciple. Those one-scene characters are believers, but they're not necessarily disciples, are they? So are you going to be a disciple? Well, then that means you got to be willing to accept suffering too, most likely, if it's the will of the Father. But that doesn't mean you're alone in that, because Jesus' power and presence is still available to us through the Eucharist, through the power of forgiveness. God forgives us, but also how we forgive our fellow brothers and sisters, and through prayer. So I think this is the key in Mark's gospel, is understanding he's trying to sustain his community and create within them a heart of faithfulness, so they may give that heart to Jesus. Hope this has been helpful to go through Mark's gospel as we've journeyed through these last 3 lectures.